The scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Throughout this Lenten series, we have studied the Hebrew prophets as they told about the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. Listen carefully as their prophecies are fulfilled in God's love manifested in Jesus, the Christ. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the tomb. Look, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven. Coming to the stone, he rolled it away and sat on it. Now his face was like lightning, and his clothes as white as snow. The guards were so terrified of him that they shook with fear and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Don't be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He isn't here, because he's been raised from the dead, just as he said. Come, see the place where they laid him. Now hurry, go, and tell his disciples he's been raised from the dead. He's going on ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. I've given the message to you." With great fear and excitement, they hurried away from the tomb and ran to tell his disciples. But Jesus met them and greeted them. They came and grabbed his feet and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers that I'm going into Galilee. They will see me there." Holy words for God's people. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Andrew. Will you pray with me, please? Holy God, may the words of my mouth, may the meditations of our hearts, may anything and everything that brought us here to this sacred moment in this sacred space help us to focus in on you, God, who loves us, who is risen. May this be a time, God, not of listening to my words or anything about what I'm about, God, but maybe about us encountering you, the sacred and holy one. We give you thanks for this chance to worship you. In your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Friends, did you hear the news this week about on Tuesday, there was a man just outside of downtown Macy's who climbed up a tree? It was about an 80-foot sequoia tree. I don't know the whole story, but from what I heard about the story, he stayed there overnight from Tuesday to Wednesday, and a lot of people shared their opinions on how this went out. I heard one person share when he eventually climbed down that the true crime was that he destroyed a tree that's been up since the 70s. And it's also known for some as the Seattle Christmas tree, from what I understand. And this is a great tree, and I think that is a tragedy when trees get hurt, but I don't know if that was the only tragedy that occurred and the only crime that occurred. And you know what's interesting? I couldn't figure out what his name was. We'll talk more about that in a bit. In our sermon series, this last Lenten series, we have been learning together about the Hebrew prophets who've spoken throughout the Old Testament. And each week we have studied how different prophets were called to prepare God's people for the coming of the Messiah. Why? Because the kingdom was coming. In our very first sermon for this series, we listened to the second prophet Isaiah as he told God's people of the kingdom to come. And I shared about my friend who likened her work to building a skyscraper. In order to build something worthy of that size of a skyscraper, it would take years of underground preparation before even 1 inch would be built upward. Now, a hole in the ground is really just the start. Once the hole is dug, pipes need to be placed, a foundation must be poured, and time is required for everything to settle. And all that work takes a lot of time. And what is your reward after digging all that and doing all that work? You find yourself in a great big hole. For the past 6 weeks, we have paused together. We have taken a look around, and the Lenten journey has given us a chance to pause and look around at the holes we find ourselves in. Now, not all holes are bad, but every hole is a sign of an unfinished project. Just like this world, we are a work in progress. And today we get to rejoice in the hope and the empty tomb and the empty cross. In the past 7 days, we have journeyed closer to Easter together, and this journey for some may feel like a labyrinth, one that we walk through not knowing exactly where we are. And we began waving just a week ago our palm branches as we examined our own hopes, our own expectations, and our desires. Along the way, we journeyed to the cross this week, and we remembered the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples. On Thursday night, Pastor Joe led us as we reflected on John chapter 13, when Jesus the Christ, who is fully human and fully divine, took out his outer robe, took the place of the lowest servant of the house, and washed his disciples' feet. And on Friday, we paused together, and we pondered the crucifixion of Jesus as we heard the words of the cross. And today we celebrate that Jesus has risen. I wonder if when Jesus taught his disciples to pray the prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," maybe he was giving us a glimpse of what the kingdom might look like, of what the kingdom should look like. I want to show you a very brief video of a very remarkable young man. I had the privilege of serving as his youth minister for much of his adolescent life. It wasn't until years later that he told me about his deep struggle with his addiction to drugs and to alcohol. I'm grateful that Brian is willing to share his story with us.
Just because one day I stopped doing drugs doesn't mean that immediately all of my behavior has changed, right?
Yeah.
Because when I've been doing all these drugs for so long, and like drugs were no longer an escape or a hobby or something to do with my friends on the weekends. Like drugs were a lifestyle. It's difficult to say, like, you know, the church feels like this absolutely safe place when, you know, like I see these people talking about Jesus and I don't understand anything about Jesus. I listen about it, I sing about it, I'm in Bible study, I'm in church, I'm in youth group, I'm doing all this stuff, and I still don't really understand what Jesus is about, right? Because I'm not in any way trying to open up, like, you know, my heart or my mind or anything like that to the idea that there's something out there that's better than like what I've got going on, right? Because I know that, you know, when I'm not under the influence of something, I'm miserable. And when I am under the influence of something, life is tolerable. But the church says I shouldn't be smoking weed, I shouldn't be doing heroin, I shouldn't be, you know, trying to find where I can get cocaine and that type of stuff. And I can take those addictive behaviors for a lot of other things, from pornography to sex to gambling. You know, all of these things that I'm naturally like really inclined to give into because it feels good for me to get that rush, right? A lot of the stuff is like, you shouldn't be doing this, you need to accept Jesus into your heart and take these behaviors. And accepting church, I know that there are a lot of churches that are working on saying, like, LGBT is absolutely welcome here, we want you as part of our community. You know, people that are working to actively have addiction recovery. It's really difficult for them to see the Christian God as a non-judgmental figure. You know, not every church is super accepting. Not every church wants to grow and evolve. A lot of churches think that growth and evolution should absolutely be like stunted out, and we're going to do things the same way we've always done. And so it's really hard to feel like the Christian God and like his house of worship is a safe place for us, unless we're also surrounded by a bunch of other people who are just as sick as we are, trying to figure out how like we're going to navigate this thing we call life.
I love that. We're just as sick as we are. It's really hard to feel like the Christian God and his house of worship is a safe place for us unless we are surrounded by a bunch of other people who are just as sick as we are, trying to navigate this thing we call life. Brian is just over 4 years sober to this day. What a beautiful and honest reminder, not the church that we are today, the church that we strive to be every day. If a tree falls in the woods and people heard it, but they denied the sound, does it make a sound? In the Gospel of Matthew, the rulers, just a couple of verses after what Andrew read to us, went to the soldiers and tried to mute their voices. Matthew's Gospel, from the angelic proclamation in the first chapter of Jesus' birth to the angelic proclamation of his resurrection constantly and consistently completes the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament's circle that the Messiah would come, that the kingdom is coming. And according to Mark and Luke, the women who came to Jesus' tomb early that morning had brought spices. They wanted to honor the Sabbath and come at the very first opportunity to prepare Jesus' body for their custom of ritual burial. But in Matthew's gospel, they have nothing in their hands that we can tell. And instead, it seems that they got up very early that morning, almost seemingly wanting to come before anyone else would be there. Maybe they were looking for peace. Just a few miles from where we sit in this very morning, there's a cemetery not far from here. I've had the honor of presiding over many funerals at this cemetery for many families, including two of my grandparents. When I first started training for my first Tough Mudder and eventually my first marathon, I found myself drawn to the cemetery and doing laps around all of its pathways. I like running the Burke Gilman Trail for long runs, but for short runs, early in the morning, there's something sacred about going to this space and this place where there's so many memories. There's something peaceful about running through there. And every time I run through there, I find myself pausing at my grandparents' tombstones and just remembering. There's something peaceful about it. I wonder if that's what the Marys were doing when they went to Jesus' graveside early that morning. But the thing is, according to Matthew, peace is the last thing that they get. Because Matthew has a flair for the dramatic. An earthquake happens, a bright shining angel comes down, guards play possum, and Jesus gives the two Marys a message that will absolutely change the world. Theologian Rob Bell once said in his book Velvet Elvis that if the gospel isn't good news for everybody, then it isn't good news for anybody. Today we celebrate that the gospel is really and truly good news for everybody. Not too long ago, I found myself sitting at Starbucks like pretty much every preacher in the U.S., preparing for sermons. And I saw these three people in an animated conversation. Now, person A was sitting in a chair kind of like this, and person B was sitting in a chair kind of like this. And they were talking animatedly with great excitement to person C, who was sitting right here. Now, person A was the one doing all the talking at first, and was trying to convince person C to accept Jesus. Here's how the conversation essentially went. Person A said, "You need Jesus because he is like an eraser for all of your sins." Person C quickly responded, "Do you mean zombie Jesus?" You know, he was raised from the dead, right? So he's a zombie, isn't he? Person A ignored that comment and went quickly and saying, "You need to get your ticket to the next spot." I'm going to assume she meant the next spot being heaven. Person C quickly responded, "What about this spot, the one that we're all in together?" Person A responded, "The earth? Too late." The whole time these two were talking, it was a greater conversation. They were rapid fire talking to one another, waiting for their turn to speak, and the entire time, person B sat attentively and quietly. Eventually, person A had to get up and answer the phone, and person A walked outside of Starbucks. After a few moments, person B leaned over to person C and simply asked, "May I ask your name?" Person C responded, "Thank you for asking." And then what happened was something beautiful. They proceeded to have a deep discussion about their lives, and person C shared all of their story, while person B got a chance to share as well. And at some point, person A came back, not paying attention to what was happening, and simply interrupted and said, "You just need to repeat these words. Jesus Christ, are you real? I promise you your life will be better this very moment. Everything will be better no matter what's happening. Just say the words. Just say it." Person C, with amazing patience and reverence, took a deep breath and said out loud, "Jesus Christ, are you real?" Pause. And after a few moments, person C said, "I don't feel anything. How do I know if this is working?" Person B picked up all of the person's stuff, walked away with simply saying, "At least I tried. Good luck." The time of talking past one another is done. Maybe it's time to look for the beautiful in one another, and you and I, we get to practice this beautiful mystery at the communion table. Maybe it's time for us to stop trying to get people to say what I need you to say and to honor exactly where you are. If a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, it still fell. The tree has still fallen. The tombstone has been rolled away. Jesus Christ has risen. My prayer is that we sit in the mystery of faith and be okay with simply the fact that maybe we don't know it all, and maybe that's okay. If the Pope washes and kisses the feet of Muslim, Christian, and Hindu refugees at a center for asylum seekers just outside of Rome this past week, maybe you and I can take a cue and a step celebrating that the good news is really good news for everyone. We worship a God who knows our name. To be the church that we're called to grow into, we get to allow for space for people to come to places like this and sacred moments like this and ask one another, may I know your name? May I hear your story? And maybe at some point we earn the right to share our own stories. Because, my friends, you are forgiven. We worship a God who knows your name and loves you. We worship Jesus, who can take our great joys and our deep hurts and everything in between and says, me too. Jesus, who understands our loneliness, who knows what it's like to be abandoned. We worship a God who knows us, who sees each and every one of us and says, I love you. You are beautiful. You are forgiven. And the world is a better place because of you. Jesus always loved you. He always will. He knows the way out of any holes we might be in because he knows the way out of the grave. Jesus knows the way out of the grave and the tomb. And my prayer is that you experience Jesus in a new and a profound way. May you find Jesus in the simplest and most sacred moments of your life. Whatever it is that you need, whatever it is that you're looking for this morning, whether it be proof for your head or your heart, may you find it today. In your bulletins, each of you has received a little blank sticky note. I would love for you to take that out this morning, please. And I want to encourage you to do something. I would love for you to write your name on this sticky note. And throughout this next week, whenever you see your name, use this as a reminder that we worship a God who knows our name. But the story doesn't just end there. We have the opportunity to ask those around us their name as well. And as we share our stories, as we take the time, not just for our turn to speak, but for the opportunity to listen, may we experience the sacredness of the Holy One. May you hear Jesus calling your name. May you know that you are beautiful. May you know that you are forgiven. And may it begin today, because Jesus has risen. Thanks be to God.